All right, we are going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is John Horning, and I am the Executive Director of Wild Earth Guardians. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. These are challenging times. We all have a lot going on. There's a lot of anxiety about what lies ahead here in the next week. And of course, we've got the backdrop of the global pandemic and all of the fallout from that. So just want to acknowledge that we're all dealing with a lot, and we're dealing with them in different ways. And I hope that the opportunities to come together like this remind ourselves of our unifying humanity. So we have Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part in this webinar. I love that. We have people from California, New Jersey, Washington, Wyoming, and of course, New Mexico and Arizona as well. Want to call out a few people. Longtime supporter Judy Williams from Santa Fe. It's good to have you. Yvonne Wilder from Denver, more recent supporter. John Soyne of Surprise, Arizona. It's good to have all of you. I like to acknowledge a few people just to offer an extra special welcome. In these Wild Earth Guardians webinars, we bring together national issue experts, people from frontline communities, elected officials, and of course, Wild Earth Guardian staff to talk about a critical issue at a critical time. As I noted, in case anyone needs a reminder, this is a critical time. We are 6 days away from the most important election in our lifetimes. The purpose of these webinars is to inform, inspire, and activate Guardians like you to help us confront powerful extractive industries, demand greater leadership from our elected officials, and it's all about solving the nature and climate crises and creating the kind of world we want. Today, we'll be talking about the Trump administration's efforts to adopt policies and practices that expand the use of cruel and barbaric tools and methods that harm native wildlife, and this anachronistic federal agency that kills millions of native wildlife every year, from wolves and mountain lions to prairie dogs and beavers. And of course, from the Trump administration's perspective, that the work that they are doing is really a part of a more systemic plan to shred our nation's environmental safety net. With me today to discuss these matters are Marlon Reese, animal rights activist, writer, and first gentleman of Colorado, and Lindsay Laris, wildlife program director for Wild Earth Guardians. It's good to have both of you, so welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And I think we've said that this is the most important election in our time. I think for a lot of elections, but it feels a lot more powerful this time. So thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah. So I want to start just by asking each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and then share why treating wildlife humanely, whether it's an iconic species like a wolf or a coyote, or perhaps even some less socially charismatic species, why that matters to you. If you could briefly both introduce yourselves and offer a perspective. Why don't you go first, Lindsay?
Sure. So as John said, my name is Lindsay Laris. I'm the wildlife program director here at Guardians. And I live in Denver right now. I actually grew up on the East Coast. I lived in California. So I've kind of have a different perspective, more of an urban perspective on wildlife. That's a little different than some people at Guardians, but I've been learning so much, and it's really expanded my thinking. I actually come from an animal welfare background. Before Guardians, I worked in animal welfare policy, mostly on sort of our domestic pets, cats and dogs, as well as farmed animals. And I always saw wildlife as kind of missing from those conversations, and I don't really understand why, and I still don't. It turns out in a lot of states that laws that make it illegal to do something harmful to your cat or dog, animal abuse laws, they specifically exempt wild animals. And I just don't understand that, because I think we've learned over time that wild animals, whether they're coyotes or prairie dogs, they have these complex emotional states. They're sentient beings, and they all deserve protection and compassion. And I thought that was kind of getting ignored a little bit by some animal welfare groups. And I'm so glad that Guardians is a conservation group that can talk about things like being compassionate for animals, as well as the conservation big ecosystem impact. So we kind of think about individual animals as well as ecosystems. And I know that wildlife obviously provides these important ecosystem benefits. So there's sort of this greater good for why protecting animals, but I also think about it on the individual level. And I'm glad that Guardians has the chance to speak out and protect wildlife.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. Marlon?
Thanks, John. And thank you, Lindsay, and to Wild Earth Guardians for always fighting the good fight. Progress on environmental and wildlife issues really depends on organizations like yours, both informing the American public, but also really galvanizing people who sometimes too often despair of trying to help when they think that there's a giant governmental machine that is attacking our wild places and our wildlife. And really all animals. Lindsay, you had mentioned sort of coming to where you're at in terms of caring about wildlife, sort of through your concern for domestic animals, companion animals, and that's really sort of where it started with me too. I, as a kid, had companion animals. We had 5 cats when I was growing up. And, I think the first time that I really felt terrible about the disparity between how animals are treated and then how people treat one another came whenever they needed a trip to the veterinarian. And we would create these lists of what can we afford? Can we afford the vet bill to save our cat? Or is that going to take money away from buying a can of coffee or a pack of cigarettes? Back then, cigarettes were just as bad as they are now, but more people smoked them, and my mother was a smoker. But, that disparity in caring and treatment was sort of born in me as a child when we decided not to provide veterinary care to our animals who were family members. And then slowly over the course of time, through children's books, movies, there was a great movie in the late 80s called The Bear, about an orphaned Kodiak grizzly, I believe in Alaska, maybe in Canada, that went on a journey to find another grizzly bear, another Kodiak grizzly to take care of it. And alongside that very tender story was the story of hunters that were pursuing, that killed the mother, and then that were pursuing the new adoptive bear. And, so it sort of started early on. I guess I had a heart to care, as I like to say. And, so it goes without saying, I'm delighted to be here with you guys today. As first gentleman, I use my platform to advance not only the welfare, but the well-being of all animals, because I've noticed that the term welfare is very often used almost in a way to say that people are superior and we're doing a favor to animals by not killing them. And I happen to believe that animals are deserving of dignity and respect simply by virtue of being here. I don't consider animals to be inferior to people. And in fact, I believe other species very often demonstrate a deeper understanding of what really matters in life. So in that way, I like to think that I learn from animals. And so I try to spend as much time as I can around them when I'm not immersed in the politics of our day, which, as John mentioned, are not particularly great right now.
Well,
and
let's
there's a lot riding.
get to those politics. And as a segue, one of the themes for both you and Marlon and Lindsay in your own life trajectory is compassion. And I think compassion is a juxtaposition to the person who is in the White House right now. So let's start the conversation by broadly characterizing the Trump administration's policies towards native carnivores and wildlife. Like, I think the participants here would like to hear how has the Trump administration behaved, and what specifically are you noting, just briefly, because there's a lot to get to, and I want to make sure we cover a lot of ground. Why don't you go, Lindsay, and then Marlon?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've created this long list of all the bad things the Trump administration has done for wildlife, and I don't want to go through all that. It's really sad, but I think that, we've seen that over the past 4 years, Trump administration and their agencies have treated wildlife as disposable entities. They're there to serve the interests of people, and when that gets interrupted, let's get rid of those animals. And they definitely don't consider animals as deserving of compassionate treatment. And I'll give a few examples and I'll kick it over to you, Marlon. I don't want to take all of them, but I noted that the first day that Zinke was at the Department of Interior, the first day in office, he reversed a rule that was banning lead ammunition use in wildlife refuges. I don't know why. I think it seems like that is so obvious. These are places that are supposed to be protected for wildlife, for advancing the needs of wildlife. And lead ammunition is not necessary, but it is something that hunters probably want to be able to use more. So, get rid of that and, damn the consequences. So Marlon, I'll kick it over to you to add some more to this.
Sure. Well, Lindsay, that was on my list too. I sort of put together sort of an exhaustive list, because when in the course of my day communicating with constituents all across Colorado, but really across America and even in other countries, it's difficult to remember what happened a week ago. The 24/7 news cycle just constantly pushes horrible, tragic decisions on the part of this administration out of the foreground. But what I have a couple of things that I'd like to point out. But before I do, I also want to say that in the past year, I've had many people come up to me and say, well, Trump signed an anti-cruelty bill. He loves animals. And I say, no, he doesn't. This man does not love animals, and he's proven it in so many ways it actually boggles the mind. When a bill that happens to help animals, as the omnibus bill last year did, it's the result of the hard work of many members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, who were able to put together a package of proposals, and then it gets delivered to Trump's desk, and all he has to do is sign it. My partner, Governor Polis, has seen it from both sides, the congressional side, the lawmaking side, and then the executive. And he likes to say that he gets credit for all the good and the bad that comes out of legislative bodies. But, I think what I'd like to say is the Trump administration has really been an unmitigated disaster, really a death sentence for wildlife all across America. And what it really comes down to is deregulation on a massive scale. Over the course of decades, as many of our viewers know, state and federal governments have installed safeguards like the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, of course, the Endangered Species Act to protect the environment and the animals with whom we share it. But what happens when we have an executive branch, a President Trump, who believes that success is measured by how much money you have in the bank, is you get policies based on instant gratification and practices that take no account of the fact that without a planet, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Money is worthless in a world in which you can't trust the air to breathe or the water to drink. Two examples that I really wanted to highlight that stand out for me of Trump's disastrous wildlife policies. In August of this year, the Trump administration finalized a plan to begin auctioning off leases to oil and gas companies to start drilling in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge is the largest remaining stretch of wilderness in the United States, and it's home to countless terrestrial and marine animals. Energy companies, by the way, understand that it is time to start moving away from fossil fuels, but they're receiving mixed messaging. Why is our federal government doubling down on oil exploration under the refuge? 5 days ago, the Bureau of Land Management put forward a proposal to begin a seismic survey in December, in just 1 month, that would look for underground signs of oil reserves over 500,000 acres on the east side of the refuge's coastal plain. For those who don't know, exploratory seismic blasting involves powerful air guns blasting seas at 10-second intervals and measuring the echoes off the seafloor to help map offshore oil and natural gas fields. The blasts are very loud. They can reach more than 250 decibels. They can be heard for miles, and they can cause hearing loss in marine mammals, disturb essential behaviors such as feeding and breeding, and they can mask communications between individual whales and dolphins. In addition to noise pollution, drilling activities will almost surely result in habitat destruction and oil spills, by the way, which we're very familiar with. And all of this is going further to exacerbate the climate crisis that we're currently confronted with. Polar bears are already on the brink. As we know, the coastal plain where seismic blasting has been proposed is the most important land-based denning habitat for polar bears. And so there's good reason to be concerned that the seismic equipment could disturb or even crush polar bear dens, which are the winter homes of females and their newborn cubs. In July 9th, also this year, I'd like to focus on just what's in recent memory here. Trump's National Park Service issued a new rule that did away with 2015 Obama-era protections for a range of predators and federal wildlife refuges, also in Alaska. And this is really heartbreaking. The new rule opens up all 10 of the state's federal preserves, so preserves that are funded by American taxpayers, to practices that include allowing hunters to kill black bears, including cubs and parents with cubs, using artificial light at denning sites, harvesting brown bears using bait, killing wolves and coyotes, including their pups, during denning season between May 1st and August 9th, killing swimming caribou from motorboats under power, killing black bears over bait, and using dogs to hunt black bears. And in 2017, Congress passed and President Trump signed a bill permitting aerial shooting from helicopters of bears, wolves, and coyotes. So to say that these activities are unsportsmanlike is a drastic understatement. It's cruelty. This is cruelty. So also in 2017, the Department of the Interior issued an order overturning an Obama-era administration ban on the controversial use of lead ammunition, which, Lindsay, you talked about. And I just want to use the California condor as an example of why lead ammunition is just horrific. in the ecosystems where it's used. The California condor was on the brink of extinction, and even now there's only 518 condors living in the wild. IUCN lists it as critically endangered. And somehow, the lead bullets used to shoot big game animals, we know condors are scavengers, so their population has really been decimated by lead bullets. So whatever you look at, whether it's opening up the refuge to oil drilling, using seismic blasting, lead bullets. The Trump administration has moved to delist grizzly bears. Thankfully, that was undone by a federal judge, but it shows where the intention is to delist grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. And then, of course, in 2019, just last year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife began the process of delisting gray wolves for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So
the list is long, and it's an exhaustive one, and it can be depressing when we recount all of what this administration is doing. You brought up both habitat destroying activities that the Trump administration is engaged in. Marlon, you brought up things that affect wildlife more directly in terms of policy and refuges. It's a relentless assault, and it can be depressing. I actually would like to, before I shift to one other question, kind of jumping ahead here, I want to remind all of our participants that we love questions. I like to reserve the final 10 minutes of these webinars from questions. And one of the ways I like to kind of facilitate that and prompt that is by taking a question about halfway through. So if anyone has questions for either Marlon or Lindsay, please just offer that in the chat box. I see we've already had some commentary there, which is great, but I encourage questions. So I'm gonna jump right to the heart of one of the sort of the main thing we wanted to talk about, which is an agency and an institution which transcends the Trump administration, even as it could be or is worse under the Trump administration. And really it's an opportunity to talk about both the past and where public attitudes are shifting, and so the opportunity to change things. There is this Federal Animal Damage Control Agency. It's been around for 89 years, I know, because it was created the same year my father was born. It recently released an annual report in which they noted that they'd killed 1.2 million animals in 2019 alone. Let's talk about why this happens and that the death toll is something that taxpayers support. So what is Wildlife Services? Why does it exist? And a little bit about its history, and I'd like to hear from both of you just briefly about your perspective on the agency at the highest level. Lindsay, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, I actually was like digging into this, and it actually was established in 1895 before it became Animal Damage Control. So Wildlife Services operates right now under the USDA, which, you think of wildlife, you don't necessarily think of agriculture, but unfortunately they're very intertwined. And they're supposed to be wildlife management, but what they're really doing is managing wildlife, mostly for the interests of the agricultural and ranching communities. And as you mentioned, the 1.2 million animals, that's actually native species. When you look at the total number of animals, which includes invasive species, I think it was closer to about 3 million this year, which is just a crazy amount of animals. And thinking about that, I think is a little bit mind-boggling. So I was trying to break this down a little bit, like what does that mean? 62,000 coyotes, 308 mountain lions, cougars, 300 wolves, and that's only in 6 states because wolves are still federally protected right now. 400 black bears, 800 bobcats, thousands of foxes, and a bunch of those foxes have been taken unintentionally, which is a really disturbing aspect of wildlife services, the number of animals that they don't intend to kill, but that they do end up killing. And then the really surprising numbers for me are about beavers and prairie dogs, because we don't think of these as these like threatening species. 25,000 beavers, 15,000 prairie dogs, and that doesn't take into account the 30,000 plus prairie dog dens, where they just don't know the number of prairie dogs that are actually being killed when they gas a den. And Marlon can talk about this more, because prairie dogs, big issue in Colorado. I never even really thought about prairie dogs much growing up on the East Coast, but it is certainly a big issue here. But when we think about the nuisance of prairie dogs and beavers versus like, it's not necessarily always a coyote coming out after eating a calf with blood on its teeth. That's not what Wildlife Services is doing. They're doing a lot of preemptive action to try to say animals that could be a threat, we want to take them out of the system now. And we've seen after years of this happening and the numbers not really going down, the preemptive culling does not work. Yet Wildlife Services continues to operate using aerial gunning. I think Marlon mentioned that, things that just are taking populations down with some sort of hope that that will reduce conflict with livestock. And this costs millions of dollars for taxpayers. It was $172 million in 2019 that went into Wildlife Services. And I think the really disturbing part is not a lot of people know that they exist. So that's a lot of the work that we are trying to do at Guardians: accountability, transparency around Wildlife Services. Yeah.
Marlon, Lindsay's final point there about so many Americans not knowing about Wildlife Services. I'm curious if you might share what your first experience with this federal agency was.
Yes. Well, you know, Lindsay did a really wonderful job. This is, as Lindsay said, it's a program under the umbrella of USDA. More specifically to, it's a program within USDA under the Animal and Plant Health, it's APHIS, Animal and Plant Health Investigative Service, perhaps. I always forget.
Inspection Service.
Inspection Service, that's, which has oversight of enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act and a whole host of different things that affect all animals. So, you know, my first, I had heard whisperings about Wildlife Services for years. And, you know, it speaks to how good they are at hiding their tracks, that even when you're involved in the work of trying to help animals, you sort of suddenly happen upon this giant program that is engaged annually in killing in just extraordinary, heartbreaking numbers of animals. And so personally, my first experience dealing with them was actually last year, when I was contacted by some advocates in Denver, here in Colorado, our capital city, who were concerned that the city of Denver had contracted with Wildlife Services to round up and kill what they perceived to be an excess number of Canada geese that were making their homes in Denver's civic parks. And the number of geese in 2019 that were killed were around 1,600. This year, they, over the summer, killed about 500. And, you know, what's interesting about this is that, you know, the information about how the geese were rounded up, where they were taken, how they were processed, required significant detective work on the part of advocates. They had to submit Colorado Open Records Act requests to our Department of Agriculture here, in addition to submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to the USDA to ultimately establish where these animals were even taken. And so I sometimes think of, and I think it's useful to people to think of wildlife services sort of as a black hole. And there have been efforts over the years, even by senior members of Congress, to get answers to what wildlife services is actually doing with money that's appropriated to them by the US Congress. And you would think as a senior member of Congress, you could easily get this information. But, even before Trump became president, it was difficult. Now we have just complete scrubbing of federal government websites and the vanishing of scientific reports. So this is an ongoing problem where this agency goes out. And I should mention also, Lindsay, you brought up unintentional killing. And, I have a list I'd love to go through of a couple of things that really disturb me about wildlife services, but definitely the non-target species that die as a result of the animals that wildlife services is called by individual cities, individual towns, and private property owners is shocking. And it includes dogs. People, they plant these M44 cyanide bombs all over the country to kill coyotes, predators, various animals, and they don't have any responsibility to notify people who might be hiking in the mountains here in Colorado, and then their dog steps on one. It's just horrific.
Secrecy and non-target animals and the cruelty therein are two things about wildlife services that just drive me absolutely crazy. When I offered, just shifting gears here, when I offered to our audience participants questions, I had seen the chat box just light up. So I'd like to get to a couple questions now and then in another 20 minutes as well. This one is from Holly Tippett from Vermont, and either one of you can take this. She says, I'm a founder of a wildlife advocacy group in Vermont. We have a strong but still emerging base of grassroots support. What can we as an all-volunteer grassroots nonprofit focused on Vermont do to help end wildlife services as it exists now? And I think the question, as you think about answering it, is really relevant to anyone in any state. Just in a minute or even less, could each of you offer your thoughts about Holly's question?
I'll opine. I think Marlon, you probably have a little bit more government experience on that question, but we actually have an advocacy toolkit on Guardian's website. And Eleni, if you have that link, you can share it on the Facebook chat or somewhere, or if you want to follow up with me, that's fine as well. But I think as Marlon pointed out, the confusing part is knowing where the contracts are with wildlife services. They can be at a city level, at a county level, or with private entities. So I think kind of trying to do that due diligence, looking at the different counties in Vermont, figuring out who has those contracts in the state and how you can go about organizing activists in those particular areas. We've worked at Guardians on these two counties in New Mexico, Doña County and Grant County, to really get some reform going on those contracts and to have those be sort of examples for the state, for other people to look at to move forward with wildlife services. It's hard at a state level, and Marlon can talk about that, but at a county, at a municipality level to start off with, I think that might be your best bet for organizing.
Marlon, what would you add, just briefly, in the interest of getting to more questions?
Well, everything Lindsay said is what I agree with. The key thing, and I'll just use the Canada geese advocates as an example. So in the beginning, there was an assumption that the state of Colorado had somehow contracted with wildlife services to come in and kill these geese. The reality is that it was a contract that the city of Denver entered into with wildlife services. And it took months for me to direct advocates to the right officials that were responsible for entering into this contract. What ended up happening was, well, where we are now, after a year of advocates sending letters to Denver City Council members, trying to work with Denver Parks and Recreation, is that the advocates have entered into sort of a volunteer partnership with the city of Denver to use non-lethal methods to try and get them off of wildlife services. One thing that I want to encourage people, because we have an election 6 days away, John, as you mentioned, there is no unimportant election. And it is so important for animal advocates to really get to know the people who are running and really pin them down on what they plan to do about animals. And so even though the advocates in Denver don't have this option for a few years, I said it will be useful to you the next time there's a candidate running to be mayor of Denver. You should ask that person, who do you plan to appoint to be the director of Denver Parks and Recreation? And does that person have an interest in contracting with wildlife services? Because that would be a hard no for many of these people. They would say, I'm not supporting you unless you commit to not working with wildlife services. The other thing is, you can always run ballot initiatives in your cities. Those are citizen generated with signatures if you want to give wildlife services the boot. And I should also be fair and say that wildlife services offers a suite of options to the individuals or cities that contract with them. Lethal management is not necessarily something that it has to be requested. So they will also give you advice about hazing and non-lethal options, but you need to ask for it. So as Lindsay said, you get to know who it was that actually contracted with them and say, what were the terms of your contract? How much did you pay? This year, I know that City of Denver residents would not be happy knowing how much Denver paid to wildlife services to kill animals that many residents actually loved seeing in the parks in a year when we have so many budget shortfalls.
Yeah, I would just add to both of your perspectives that in addition to working at the city, county, and even state level on wildlife services, it is a federal agency. And so I would, Marlon noted this, that in the past there have been efforts to defund the agency's lethal control budget. And I'd like to see that initiative supported. And so educating your congressional representatives. I'd like to get to one more question, then a few of ours. The chat box is on fire. This is from Pamela DeBellis. If Proposition 114, wolf reintroduction in Colorado, for those who are not from Colorado and don't know that, if it does not pass and wolves are delisted at the federal level, what can be done at the state level to protect them? And again, as you respond, Marlon and Lindsay, let's try and be brief because the chat box is on fire and I'd like to get to as many of those questions as well and a few more of ours that we lined up before the webinar.
Sure. Well, I'm definitely interested in hearing Marlon's perspective on this, but at Guardians level, we're working with some other groups to develop what we are calling the gold standard wolf management plan. And what we're hoping is to create sort of a model plan to be able to go to agencies like Colorado Parks and Wildlife and encourage them to develop policies around non-lethal management of wolves as they come back into the state, which we had a few that did come back in naturally on their own. And I think that that's a concern, whether or not the ballot initiative passes. There may be a period where wolves are delisted, just all these contingencies, making sure that the Parks and Wildlife Agency responds to the wishes of the people of the state and doesn't just take in sort of the old school management approaches, I think is really important.
Marlon, what would you add to that?
Absolutely, Lindsay. And I I would say I've actually been in conversation with leadership at Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The governor and I talk about this frequently. If the gray wolf loses its Endangered Species Act protections, there is absolutely a responsibility at the state level to institute protections that are equal to, if not even greater than those granted under the Endangered Species Act. And that's a priority for me, certainly, and it's something that I'll, regardless of which way 114 goes, that's something that we're going to be doing. I also want to emphasize that a lot of people think that gray wolves are going to come back here on their own. And they forget that in order to get here, they need to come from Wyoming. And Wyoming has exclusion zones where they can be shot. And there were a number of wolves that, a pack of 6 that had come here and been reported on widely a few months ago. And 3 of those wolves were identified as having been shot on the Wyoming side of the border. And so we really need to treat this issue the way it is. We want to, if the voters will it, we want to establish wolves in Colorado and protect them. And the administration takes the will of the voters very seriously. And so however they vote, that is what is going to happen. And I would love, Lindsay, to connect with you actually about the work that Guardians is doing on creating sort of that gold standard restoration, because we're very, very concerned about that. We want them to be here. If they are here, we want them to be protected at the highest level.
And I would just add that in addition to the work that is critical at the state level, when the Trump administration, we believe it's going to happen tomorrow, announces the delisting of wolves, we will be swiftly engaging with a lawsuit. So just everyone know that we'll be doing our best in the federal courts to overturn that decision. The chat box is still on fire. Here's what I propose. We do one more question, and then we spend the last 15 minutes or so answering questions from the audience. I want to talk about something that you mentioned, Lindsay, which is cyanide bombs. One of the more, actually you mentioned it, Marlon, one of the more brutal tools in the toolbox for wildlife services. But to you, Lindsay, the question, what has the Trump administration done in response to our and other wildlife and animal humane advocates' calls to completely prohibit these tools, not just on public lands, but everywhere?
Well, in a word, they've done nothing. So I think that's an easy question to answer, but a little bit longer. We had filed a petition with some other groups with the EPA to get sodium cyanide bombs banned, and the EPA sort of wavered on the decision for a little while, but just recently, I think it was December 2019, issued a final decision that they would not be banned. And these are devices that are only used by wildlife services. They're not used for, garden variety, pest control, anything like that. They're manufactured at one place in Pocatello, Idaho, and they're only used by wildlife services. And the interesting thing is, over the past few years, we've seen sort of a will to not use them. Oregon just passed a ban at a state level. There's a bill that is in Congress right now called Canyons Law that some of our great reps in Colorado have also co-sponsored. That is about banning these products, the use of these devices across the country. And obviously we've had kind of a crazy year, but we do hope to reignite the Canyons Law efforts going forward. We've seen Oregon ban them. We've as a result of a Guardians lawsuit, we have a settlement agreement in Montana right now. They're not allowed to be used there. Idaho has a temporary ban because of an incident involving a 14-year-old named Canyon, who did, as Marlon was talking about, went out with his dog, stepped on one of them, the dog died, and he was injured, Canyon. So Idaho's not using them, but we do have states across the West, such as New Mexico, Nevada, that are using them a lot. and we think they're incredibly dangerous. And it seems just like common sense to have a federal ban on these devices.
Yep, we've got work to do both at the federal level and at the state level. And I want all of our audience to know we're making lots of progress. I've been at this work for almost 30 years, and the progress we've made in the last 5 years on cyanide bombs in particular has been really, really encouraging. So let's get to some more questions, because again, the chat box is really heating up. Big questions. Let's try and be precise with our answers. Diana Black, how can we radically redefine, rewrite the principle underlying this Wildlife Services Agency and expose their hidden and corrupt agenda? Lots of sort of other questions. I'll only ask one other question from her. How can this be achieved via the executive and judicial branch so as to uphold and enforce wildlife conservation rather than its persecution? What are your thoughts briefly on that, Marlon?
Yeah, it's really a wonderful question, and the answer is deceptively simple, although it has proven elusive. So, Wildlife Services feels some sort of immunity to congressional requests from individual members. Peter DeFazio was the one that I mentioned, and so the first step, in my opinion, is to issue, if answers are not forthcoming when members of Congress request it, then there need to be subpoenas to appear before committees of jurisdiction in Washington. This is, as we've said, taxpayer money that is funding this organization, and yet the primary customers that use this organization are private landowners, ranchers, and members of the agriculture community who are sort of taking advantage of the fact that the federal government will come in and prematurely kill what they perceive to be nuisance species, even if there isn't already a problem. And so what we need to do, something that I have an interest in doing and that I'm looking at next year, is I think we, here in Colorado, we have a wonderful member of Congress, actually the governor's successor, Congressman Joe Neguse, and he's on the House Natural Resources Committee. That committee is also headed up by another wonderful Congressman, Raul Grijalva, who I had the pleasure of calling a friend when I was in Washington. And we have Senate leadership on their Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And I think what there needs to be is a concerted push, enough requests coming in from voters, from constituents, to those members saying, what is this organization? What is this department? We need to get an audit together. We need to figure out how the money is being spent. And then we need an explanation of why it's being spent in the way that it is, because we have competing narratives. And this was something that I wanted to mention earlier. We have protections granted to animals under laws like the Endangered Species Act, but also laws like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And there's a disconnect because those same animals that are protected by one law are killed by Wildlife Services through sort of a backdoor process where they get a permit. And I wanted to just read this one statement because I think it's enlightening. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in talking about delisting the gray wolf, has this to say. They say, the gray wolf joins the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, American alligator, brown pelican, and 33 other species of animals and plants in U.S. states, territories, and waters that have been brought back from the brink with the help of the Endangered Species Act. In 2019, last year, Wildlife Services killed 40,714 bald eagles, 251 peregrine falcons, and 5,205 brown pelicans. So what is this? On the one hand, we protect, and on the other, we kill. So I think that this agency needs to be looked at for consistency's sake. You know, what message are we sending to the public? Do we want to protect animals? Do we not want to? It doesn't work if we bring them right back from the brink and then immediately take them off the list and say it's open season.
Right. I think that's a good point, and I've been thinking about that, and I think the sort of the disconnect is we have Department of Interior heading, recovering species, and then we have the Department of Agriculture over which oversees Wildlife Services killing animals, and maybe they're not communicating in the way that they should be. And it's same thing with like National Park Service and BLM lands under one and Forest Service under another, and there's definitely a disconnect going on there.
Well, and as you noted though, Lindsay, I think about the historical origins of these agencies and the fact that they arose at a time when there was widespread public consensus that we want to get rid of wolves. And so we did that, and we employed the resources of the federal government to do so. Public attitudes have shifted dramatically, even more so in the last 10 to 20 years. And yet we have these entrenched institutions who, as you were noting, Marlon, operate in the shadows under a veil of secrecy. And so part of the benefit, part of our role is to do things like this and to be talking about this agency and to be demanding that its activities be under the full spotlight of public discourse. Because I think everyone believes that if we continue to shine the spotlight, the agency won't be able to continue the ways in which it's operated for centuries, for decades, sorry. Just a few more questions, because I really like to get to audience's questions. And this was mentioning the lawsuit if wolves are delisted. How concerned are we about the conservative majority on the Supreme Court? And if you are worried, how are organizations like Wild Earth Guardians preparing for conservative rulings? What are your thoughts on that, Lindsay?
So that's a tough question. I think that because there is just a new judge right now, it's at the Supreme Court, I'm not overly concerned that tomorrow we're going to have to deal with these questions. I hope that the Supreme Court doesn't, if there are rulings at lower courts, would not necessarily take up this issue of wildlife and species. But obviously we have created a lot of case law protecting the environment at the Supreme Court level. So I think it really makes it even more important that we have the right people in offices at an executive level, at the agency level, who are appointing agency heads. We have the right people in Congress who can make laws, because if we can make good laws, we won't have to go to the courts as much. We won't have to rely on courts to do the right thing. We can have our elected officials doing what actually represents the will of the majority.
Marlon, anything to add briefly there?
Yeah, Lindsay steals my thunder every time. I'm very happy though. I love it, because this is what Wild Earth Guardians is all about. The court is definitely concerning to the extent that laws that have already passed, it's the job of the Supreme Court to interpret those laws, hopefully, ideally, without imposing a political agenda on their rulings. But I agree completely with Lindsay, and this is why I think it's so important. Every race is so important, but but to have a legislative branch, both houses in Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, then you have lawmakers writing great laws that protect animals. And then you have a president, hopefully, who signs those great laws. And then that's the law of the land. There may be cases brought forward, perhaps that reach the Supreme Court, but when the laws are written well, the only thing the Supreme Court can do is to say if something is constitutional or unconstitutional. We really look to Congress, and we really look to the executive, the president, to sort of have oversight of this so that we don't even have to worry about the court. And so this is also such a great opportunity. I want to make a plug here. In 6 days, we're going to at least know the preliminary results of this election. And I have, of course, my own personal hopes. But now will be the time, with the influx of new members of Congress, potentially a new president. This is the time for advocates to get in there before all of the entrenched traditional interests come in and try to make an argument for why nothing should change. So, I hope advocates are sort of gearing up and they have their arguments in mind and they're ready on November 4th to start making phone calls and putting these issues on the map for our elected officials so that in the new year, nothing is a surprise. I know that's how the governor, how Jared had dealt with things when he was a member of Congress. Advocates came to his office. They called him and they said, this is important to us. And so it was important to him.
Sure.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue to the last question I wanted to ask. And we only have a minute for it because I'd like to both end when we said we were going to end at 1, be mindful of people's time, and offer just a brief closing. What can, you're both Coloradans, live on the Front Range of Colorado. What can, in probably 30 seconds, what can Colorado's federal delegation do to help reform this federal agency, Wildlife Services?
Well, do you want to go first, Lindsay?
No, I'll let you go first so I don't steal your thunder. Go, Marla.
No. The only thing I was going to say is that it's important to get in touch with your senator and your representative, even if they're not on the so-called committee of jurisdiction. In this case, it would be natural resources or ag. The Ag Committee. Even if they're not on those committees, they can still call hearings if they're in leadership positions, so the chair of committees. They can still call hearings together and they can call witnesses from Wildlife Services and then question them. And so the idea of sort of shining a light on what is a problematic program within USDA is definitely within reach. And so that's something that I would recommend. And then following up on what Lindsay said earlier, there's the municipal level and then there's the federal level. It's a federal agency operating on a municipal level. So it's in your backyard. So really finding out who has the contracts with Wildlife Services, because that is going to be happening on a state level. And perhaps in your own city, I don't think most Denverites know that Wildlife Services is the agency that came in and rounded up the Canada geese. So it really pays to ask your questions and get to know who it is that's seeking your vote.
Lindsay, we're nearly out of time. Go.
I'll just say I agree with Marlon because I wanted to end on time and I want you to get your closing. And I think we also will maybe have a new senator here in Colorado. So we have another opportunity to bring somebody new into this fold of caring about wildlife, and that will be a great relationship to build.
Yep. Great. Well, it's a good note to close on, because even though we can be discouraged in these times, our elected officials are responsive to those who vote them in or vote them out. And so just always remind ourselves of that. These are obviously critical times for our nation and for the natural world. We've got a president who's inflaming tensions and exploiting the vulnerable. And I just firmly believe that protecting wildlife is one step we can take to defend compassion and confront the violence that we see. So I urge each and every one of you to vote for candidates who believe in silence and the rule of law and who act with care and kindness for all life. And I want to thank you, Marlon and Lindsay, not only for joining me today, but for your work on behalf of native carnivores and animals everywhere. And thank you to the audience. We've done these for the last 5 weeks. We've never had the chat box light up quite like that. So love the passion and the questions that were evidenced there. So thank you all, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thanks, John, Lindsay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.